Hi, I'm Mary Steenburgen. If you don't know who I am by now, why are you watching me anyway? Anyway, welcome to a session in which I will attempt to share with you what has taken me 50 years to learn. Boy, are you lucky. We're going to be discussing harmony and notation and voicings and blues and jazz and all kinds of concepts. But it might be instructive if I tell you how I got into playing jazz in the first place. I came in through the back door when I was 13 or 14 or 15, although I occasionally heard jazz on the radio because it was part of the American mainstream music in those days. I hadn't really plugged into it. But the big idol in the late 30s was a gentleman piano player named Eddie Duchin. They later made a movie of his life. He was big, like, an Elvis Presley is big, or Barbra Streisand, whoever. And half the teenagers in America wanted to be like, as we say, Eddie Duchin. And as a result of that, almost all of us learned how to play some introductions that Mr. Duchin introduced in those days. And to this day, a lot of teenagers play these things. For example, and then there were many variations in different keys. And some of my buddies and I, when we were 14 or 15, used to sit down, two of us at one piano, and play little four-hand selections, duets, with one of us doing this. And the big song in that day, because you could play the first 16 bars of it with these Sears and Roebuck chords, was Heart and Soul. So we went. So forth. That's not in the chord changes, but I'm improving things. Anyway, one day it literally occurred to me that if I could learn to do that left-hand stuff by myself and continue to play with one finger on the melody, I would be a piano player. So it took me about 2 weeks to get the two halves of my brain together, and finally this is what I was playing. And so forth. And that was so much fun, I've never stopped. So I've always been indebted to Mr. Duchin, and so have millions of other young folks of that day, even though not all of us went on to play jazz. One of the reasons for Eddie Duchin's great popularity, he was the biggest, is that he played wonderful songs. He played Broadway show tunes, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, Cole Porter, that classy stuff. And he played pretty, not jazz, but very pretty stuff. So many of us in that day were influenced by his romanticism and the general prettiness of his playing. You might have noticed earlier when I was just running through that simple chorus of Tenderly. There's a prettiness there, which I don't think is a bad idea. In fact, my favorite jazz artists over the whole 60-year span or so have been those who played up a storm and had great chops, but always had something pretty to their playing. Lester Young would be one example. And even some of the bop guys could do it. The best of them all, Charlie Parker, has had albums made of his solos voiced for 5 saxes, because no matter how fast or how hard he was swinging, there was always a pretty element to his playing. So hooray for that. We need more of that in the world. Then some other, I had a note here too. Oh yes. Another thing that we're going to be talking about is harmony. Now, I play by ear, and just as I write my songs by ear with practically no background training or even often understanding of what I'm doing, my harmonic sense has been largely developed by ear, too. Now, that's nice for me, but don't get off on that side track. I have seen one of the video tapes of this instruction series by Warren Bernhardt, and I plan to spend a lot more time with it because he is a superb teacher, especially of harmonics. So I'll be talking about that. But for the better instruction, please do go to that particular tape because he's a marvelous instructor, and I plan to learn from him, and I've already started doing that. If you're a beginner, as you probably are, you might have trouble getting any bass players or drummers to work with you. If they're beginners too, they're willing to, but they probably won't help you any, so forget them for now until they improve. And the real pros won't want to sit in with you either. So a solution to that is to get some pre-recorded computer-type rock or jazz, any kind of rhythm tracks because using that demonstrates to you and gets you accustomed to the importance of relating the playing of your ideas to the underlying rhythm. You could theoretically be a good player, except you couldn't keep time, and therefore you couldn't get any work, except as perhaps a saloon pianist. For example, I'll hit a track here and see what pops up, and then we'll try to play a little jazz with that. And it is a good idea because, first of all, it gives you a kind of a psychological feeling of being in a group, and I repeat, it gets you practiced at keeping strict rhythm, which is important. So let's see. Yeah. You can do that for hours at a time, but for now we don't want to spend too much time just me having fun. I'm supposed to be teaching you something. Now, even if you personally knew nothing whatever about the piano, if you were just thinking of maybe studying it someday, you would have no trouble grasping the simple point that as regards, let's say, the simplest chord there is, the C chord, which is in the most primitive form involves just these three notes, C, E, and G. You have no trouble perceiving that there are many different ways in which you can combine those three notes, C, E, G, without changing the fact that what you're playing is still a C chord. For example, instead of having the C here at the bottom, see there it is, you could lift it out, so to speak, and play the C here. It's a different voicing. It's interesting why they use that word voice, because it has to do with the human noise we make with our mouths. But who cares about those problems? Anyway, it's still a C chord. Or you can take this E out of its most common position and add it here. And that too is a C chord. So there's any number of ways, as I say, in this case with the C in the middle, or however you want to look at it. Then there are ways that you can, again while still playing a C chord, enrich it. You might want to, for example, add the sixth note of the scale, which in this case is A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's your A. And that means you would be playing what is sort of in the basic sense a C, but now it's called a C sixth. And see how much richer, prettier. That sounds like what used to be called close harmony. For voice vocal groups, use that kind of thing a lot. The High-Lows, the Freshmen, all those great groups, the Modern Airs. Again, it relates to this, but it's prettier, richer. Now, there are other cases where you can use only two notes of a chord, rather than the usual three or more, and still have it recognizable as what it is. Let's say we're talking about the C chord. This is particularly the case when what you're playing is what we call tenths, T-E-N-T-H-S, tenths. It's based, of course, on the number 10 and all that. In the first note and the second note, there are 10 spaces, 10 notes. So there's a C tenth, and there's a E flat tenth, F minor tenth, G minor tenth. And if you listen to old jazz piano recordings, and by the way, do that, listen to all the great, and even for that matter, the lousy piano recordings you can lay your hands on, you will learn something literally from every one of them. From the lousy ones, you'll learn what not to do, and maybe you'll pick up a pointer or two that would not have occurred to you yourself. Anyway, when you do listen to the recordings, especially from the 20s and early 30s, and isn't it marvelous we have these time capsules? We can really go back musically to 1926 if you want to. You won't hear many examples. I guess in the mid-1930s and for chiefly the following 20 years, you do hear more of that sort of thing. Some jazz pianists, Teddy Wilson is a particular example, employed combination with right way, but if you're a little lazy, you can also save yourself a little trouble by not playing what is called stride piano, in which the left hand hits either a single note or an octave, relatively low on the keyboard, and then very quickly that same hand jumps up here and plays the chord that goes with it to refer to those old Eddie Duchin things again, if you were playing stride, I'll do it slowly, it would go like this. And as I told you, that's how I originally began to play pop music anyway, by learning to do that with one hand, whereas the Eddie Duchin school did it with two hands. And Eddie used to use that as an introduction to many of his great recordings and live performances. Now, you get a vigorous, peppy, swinging feeling with the stride style. You hear that in a lot of the old guys, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, many of the great players of the 20s and 30s. Whereas, by comparison, with the use of tenths, you get more a feeling of smoothness and prettiness and sometimes harmonic sophistication. I'll show you something that Teddy Wilson showed me when I was doing the Benny Goodman movie. He was in it, of course, and I didn't care that much about the movie, but I loved hanging out with Teddy Wilson and Gene Krupa and all those great players. This is a sequence of tenths he showed me on a particular song, and never mind the song, but this is what he showed me. Again, just watch the left hand. Repeat. And as soon as I learned that, the part of my brain that composes music went to work up here, and I wrote several songs that relate to that sort of group of chords. One went... So again, notice the smoothness, and Art Tatum was also very given to that sort of thing, harmonic richness and a sort of a pretty quality when you use that. It's distinguished from the old, what you might associate with the Count Basie, which is... Don't the moon look lonesome shining through the trees? So forth. Then, starting in, I'm pretty sure it was the late 1940s, a number of creative young pianists, some of the bebop or bop school as it was called, began to make very rare use of tenths, and for that matter also they rarely used the old stride rhythm style. In fact, they began to use their left hands much less as a rhythm instrument. The piano to this day is considered one of the rhythm instruments. The others are the guitar or banjo or whatever, and the drums and the bass. There usually are said to be four rhythm in a band that has those players. And it'll never stop, the piano will never stop being considered a rhythm instrument. It's just that it's much more than that. You might not always enjoy a drum solo, even from the greatest, but you'll always enjoy a piano solo for a number of obvious reasons. So anyway, the modern guys, generally starting around 1950 or so, they began to use their left hands chiefly to play peck or accent chords while doing the singing jazz solo, so to speak, with the notes in the right hand. So you hear that a lot today, and there's nothing wrong with that. I hope you'll learn to do that, but I wouldn't totally lose the other stuff, because the great players like Oscar Peterson, for example, he has it all. He hasn't thrown anything away from the 1920s, so you shouldn't either. Now let's talk again about harmony. That'll keep coming up in your entire career as a pianist, so you'll never give up on it, or you'll never think you know it all. So to refer again to the area of harmony, you will want to familiarize yourself with what can be called the circle of fourths. We're talking about 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, starting at any arbitrary point. For reasons that are rather mysterious, historic, and even now not totally clear, but because we are accustomed to such relationships in Western European American music, there's something about certain chords that seems naturally to lead to other chords. For example, something sort of sensible sounding about that. That's not the only alternative. You can go from that to another chord, and there are additional possibilities. But the point is here that there are rules of traffic in music too. You can't just jump from something to any other note or combination and expect people to listen to it. You have the freedom to do so, but it usually sounds terrible. So there's not much of a market for it. So again, to use an illustration with C, the simplest note of all, C is our bass line. Let's say we're playing a C seventh. 1, 3, 5. Now this is, strictly speaking, the seventh note in the C scale, but and there is such a chord. That's called a C major. And this is where you minor or flat the seventh note, and that's the form in which it's usually used. Now you can take these two notes and put them down here, so you get, but however you voice it, it's still a C7. Now you ordinarily would not finish a song with that. It sounds somehow incomplete. So it creates sort of a mysterious appetite for something else, and that something else is what they usually refer to as a resolution, or at least a progression. A lot of terms in music, as there are in motorcycle maintenance and knitting and everything else, so might as well get hip to all the terms. Now if you count up 4 notes from C, 1, 2, 3, 4, what we want to hear is either an F chord or an F7th. And then if you count up from the F, 1, 2, 3, 4, then you get a B flat 7th. And from the B flat, 1, 2, 3, 4, an E flat 7th. And from that, 1, 2, 3, 4, an A flat 7th, and so forth. You go all around the circle of keys that way if you want to. So in your spare time, spend quite a lot of time familiarizing yourself with that. You can do it formally, ask your instructor to explain more of it to you, watch Mr. Bernhardt's tape about that, but also play with it yourself. It's one thing to attend a lecture or see a tape and agree with every word and learn something from it, but unless you put it into practice, a lot of it will blow away. Now, another interesting thing about chords and their harmonic relationship is that, especially in modern jazz playing, you can play what will serve as, let's say, a D7th or a D9th, and yet, oddly enough, never have an actual D in the chord. There would be an example. This is sort of implied, but a lot of the modern guys are not playing it. It's nice if the bass player does it, or you hum it or something, but you can get away with this. And again, it applies to all keys. I'm just selecting this particular illustration at random. You can see again these 3 notes. Now it'll be nice, I repeat, if in the bass player, or your left hand somehow, is playing the D root relationship, because then that gives you the equivalent of this D up here. But this relationship without the root note, is perfectly acceptable and these days quite common. One of the things that all jazz people are involved with is the form loosely described as the blues. Let's consider again the scale, and again, for simplicity's sake, work with the scale in C. For reasons we don't have to go into, if we take the 3rd note and we go down a half step, which is to say we flat that note, not flatten, but flat, somehow that does sound related to jazz and the blues. It sounds hipper. And the same point applies to doing the same thing to the 5th note. That's the G, and if we flat it, that too is a very common, I won't say device, because that's not quite what it is, but these 2 notes in a scale often give a solo a feeling of bluesiness or jazziness. So you should be familiar with that. One of the thrilling things, fascinating things about jazz is that if you gave 100 jazz players, let's say, the same tune, let's say Honeysuckle Rose, and you said, just sit down here, Mac, and play a chorus of that, no two of them would play it the same way. Some of them might stick to the original harmonies. Probably not many would even do that. But just think of that. 100 guys playing the same song and no two of them doing it the same. And if you were the 101st one, even though at this point you might not be a great player yet, you too would have something to contribute that Earl Garner didn't if he were in the list, you see. For example, the other day I was playing that song not long ago, just monkeying around at home, and I asked myself, what if at a certain point I began to do descending half steps in tenths, again going in half steps down south here on the keyboard. I just asked myself, I didn't know whether it would sound good or terrible, and it turned out to be very interesting. And I've since then showed it to some guys who play much better than I do, and they were fascinated by it. That has never occurred to them. So I'll just to play it slowly. You can play any tune fast or slow. I'll play it slowly. It'll make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. Now watch. And again. Now we're in A flat. Down steps. Then the bridge conventionally and back to that. So there's not going to be any headline in the papers around the country about this, but nobody else ever thought of it before, and I'm definitely not one of the world's great players. So you too have that freedom to be spontaneously creative and to try things. Sometimes you'll try something that'll be just dreadful, and you'll never do that again. But who knows, you might stumble over something that will enable you to retain it and use it again. So now let's talk about what are called runs, R-U-N-S. That simply means lots of notes played in either ascending or descending order. For example, that's an example of a run. Now eventually, a few years down the line, you should definitely master that ability, simply because all the superior players do it. It's a good addition to your palette of musical colors, so to speak. Doesn't mean that if you're great in all other ways, you can't make a living without that, but since everybody does it, don't argue. Just learn how to do that. But here's kind of a cute point. Before you learn to do that properly, and your teacher will show you how, there's a way of doing a fake run. It sounds almost exactly like a legitimate one, but it isn't. And it's accomplished simply, you'll be very disappointed when I tell you, it's accomplished simply by running the back of your thumb down the black keys, or for that matter, not your thumb in this case, the back of your hand, up the black keys. Now obviously if you're playing in a key that involves mostly white keys, such as C, or F, or G, that trick ordinarily will not work, because the harmonies you're playing in doing your run will clash or disagree with the harmonies you're likely to be playing with your left hand. That's true most of the time, but isn't it lovely how many exceptions there are in life? For example, suppose you're in C and you're going from an E minor and you're headed for a D minor. And there's nothing wrong with going from one to the other. But what a lot of guys will do is they'll take a little step between that where they go like this. Again, that note and this note. So while you're even in the key of C, I repeat, going from that, when you hit this, see, it works. Now, remember that any run may also be interpreted as a very big chord with the notes played one at a time. A chord, C-H-O-R-D, a chord is a collection of anywhere from 2 to an infinite number of notes. If you had a creature from another planet and he had 5 hands with, say, 7 fingers on each hand, he would be physically able to play a 35-note chord, wouldn't he? But that's science fiction. As a more practical matter, generally a chord consists of 3 or 4 notes. So again, when you're playing 20 or 30 notes with one of your descending runs, or even if you're doing it the right way, there are some chords that you are in effect playing. The basic one would be G flat. Here's your G, and one step down, of course, a half step is your G flat. So that, since it consists of many of the notes you're going to play with your thumb, works very easily. Or consider the A flat 9th or 7th. Against that chord too, since it has a lot of black notes in it, you can also get away with doing this. Works very nicely. And E flat minor. The run works just fine. Another little point, not major, little, but worth talking about, concerns what are called trills, not thrills. A trill is a thrill if you're from Brooklyn, but a trill is just a little thing. You can play it on any instrument, and it's not one limited thing. It's anytime you play 2 or 3 notes, but in a kind of a little canary bird relationship, for example, or those are among the possibilities of playing trills. Naturally, we don't expect that when you master a trill, the whole world will fall down and say, wow, what a great player. But it's just one more little trick of the trade, and it comes in handy in playing jazz. You can also sometimes add a note of sweetness and beauty to an out-of-tempo passage. By that means, I'll play one of my songs, a few bars of it here, called Impossible, and I'll throw in a trill or two to see you. You shouldn't overuse it, but anyway, it's a nice color, for example. See? About trills. The trill, of course, did not originate in modern music. It's been part of the legitimate classic language for centuries. And therefore, obviously, as I've earlier said, it's not limited to jazz, but one more little device that can enrich your playing of jazz. Playing jazz, like doing many things, is a matter of mastering a fairly long or even a short list of tricks of the trade, and then of developing the judgment as to when to apply trick A, or when not to apply trick 17, or whatever. One has to do with something that I think was popular in the 1920s. I never heard this exact link, but there were piano tricks that were common in those days, late 20s, early 30s. There was a man named Zez, Z-E-Z, Confrey. He wrote at least one song which is famous called Kitten on the Keys. And a lot of the guys in that day, including a very fine pianist of the 30s named Bob Zurke, Z-U-R-K-E, did this. Let's say we're working with a C7th, or now it has to do with adding to that as your basic factor, the factor of this rhythmic thing, which I'll at the moment do with my mouth. And I'll do it very slowly. When you do it fast, it sounds like this. Again. And if you're an F, in B flat 7, E flat 7. So you don't want to overuse that, or it becomes obviously a trick, and you can work it into the ground. But it's a nice little extra thing to have available to you if you suddenly have a C7 chord coming up and you're playing jazz and you can't think of anything brilliantly new to do about it. I often go back to. So there's one more trick for you. Then there's another thing I mentioned earlier that particularly in the 1930s, a lot of the jazz players would play their ideas that sounded a lot, as I said, like trumpet ideas by just using octaves. That sort of stuff. Nothing wrong with it. But another little gimmick is that you can do on the piano the equivalent of what a trumpet player gets by doing a vibrato. Now you can't make no matter how much you do that, you can do that on a violin string and get that sort of a little feeling, but you can't, the piano will only make that noise no matter what stick you do with your little finger. However, you can get an illusion or an equivalent, let's say, of that vibrato. Singers use it a lot. A guy will go, and the moon, especially blues singers and stuff. So all you do is rattle it or roll it or use your own language, I don't care. If it's tough for you, especially at first, to get the rattly effect, what you can do is position one of your other fingers, the second or third, doesn't matter, as a sort of a pivot, and you can oscillate off that pivot. If you don't need that, then don't bother about it. I'm not promoting this because it's not available anyway. You couldn't buy a copy if you wanted to. It's been long out of print. But I'll show you this. I'll hold it steady. Yes. As you can see, it says The Discovery of Buck Hammer. And there's a pen and ink sketch of a rather portly black gentleman. The important point is that there is no such person as Buck Hammer. This was a put-on, but the music was serious. I did this, Lord, it must be about 30 years ago. Just a little prank on the jazz critics, practical joke, you might say. And it had some very serious scholarly liner notes, except, as I repeat, it was a total put-on. And the jazz critics loved it. They liked my playing much more once they thought I was black and dead than my actual situation. But anyway, it was full of boogie-woogie playing, because to return to my opening comments about Eddie Duchin, at that same time in the 1930s, boogie-woogie as a piano style swept the country. There were Albert Ammons and Meade Lux Lewis and a lot of the great players in that style. And because a lot of the boogie-woogie licks involve these sort of these discordances, which are now considered part of funk, I think really that is where funk sort of got started in a sense. Now, there is no limit to the possible bass figures. You could make one up yourself, and good, you pioneered new territory. But there are some which are classics. One of the earliest is simply a walking bass in which you play a succession of octaves, like this. And then going into F, and so forth. Then there are others which go, or you can play it in a kind of a train rhythm, or and then there was a man named Freddie Slack who did a lot of good boogie-woogie playing, and he had his own basses which tended to go like this. one that's the simplest of all, which I often use. And then, of course, if we're playing in C, then when you go up to the F change, and when you go to the G change, to the F, back to the C. Now I'll play an actual boogie-woogie number for you. It's just the blues. The harmonics are simply the blues.